Before the world learned how to save everything, it learned how to forget. People talk about the 1960s like they were loud, colorful, revolutionary. But the truth is, most of what defined those years was quiet, ordinary, so common it never felt worth naming. And that's exactly why it disappeared. Tonight, I want to walk back through 50 forgotten things from 1960s America, not as a checklist, but as moments you once lived inside, without realizing they would someday vanish. If some of them feel familiar, that's because they were never meant to last. How slowly news traveled. In the 1960s, news didn't follow you. It waited. That's the part that feels almost impossible to explain now. Information had a place, a location, a time it belonged to. It didn't spill into every corner of the day. It didn't interrupt. It arrived when it was ready, and when you were ready for it. Most mornings began the same way. The sound of paper, not a notification, not a voice, but the dry, familiar rustle of pages being unfolded. News came in columns, in ink that stained your fingers if you weren't careful. You didn't skim headlines at a glance. You sat with them. You read slowly, sometimes twice, because there was nowhere else for the information to go. If something happened late in the day, you often didn't know about it yet. And that gap, that space between the event and your awareness of it, was normal, accepted. It gave the world time to breathe. Radio stayed on counters or shelves. They weren't carried. They didn't demand attention. You turned them on deliberately. You listened while doing something else, washing dishes, tying shoes, waiting for water to boil. The news voice became part of the room, not the center of it. And when the radio went quiet, it stayed quiet. There was no endless stream, no updates every few minutes. If you missed something, you missed it. And strangely, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like balance. Long-distance information felt heavier, important. If news came from far away, you sensed the distance in the way it was spoken. Voices slowed down. Words were chosen carefully. There was respect for what hadn't arrived yet. Television news was an event, not a habit. People sat down for it. Chairs faced the screen. The room rearranged itself. And when it ended, that was it. The screen didn't glow afterward, waiting for the next thing. It went dark. The darkness mattered. It told you the day had a shape, a beginning, a middle, an end. Between those moments of information, life continued uninterrupted. Conversations weren't paused mid-sentence by breaking alerts. Meals weren't eaten while glancing at headlines. People argued about the news later, after they'd had time to absorb it. And sometimes they didn't argue at all. Not knowing everything immediately didn't feel dangerous. It felt natural. The world wasn't trying to be solved in real time. It unfolded at its own pace. Weather forecasts were cautious. Predictions were short. No one promised certainty. If a storm came early or late, you adjusted. You didn't feel betrayed by the information. You understood its limits. That slowness created something we didn't know how to name at the time. Trust. Trust that the important things would reach you eventually. Trust that not everything required an immediate reaction. Trust that silence wasn't a failure of communication, but part of it. Looking back, I realize how much space that gave the mind, how thoughts had room to finish themselves, how worry didn't stack endlessly on top of itself. You could hear one piece of news, sit with it, then let it go. There was time between knowing and responding. Today, information arrives before we're ready, sometimes before it's even complete. It competes for attention, urgency, emotion. It asks for reaction instead of reflection. In the 1960s, news didn't ask that much of you. It respected your time because it shared it. And when the paper was folded and the radio turned off, the world didn't feel unfinished. It felt whole. Long-distance phone calls that felt serious. In the 1960s, distance had weight. You could feel it before you ever picked up the phone. Distance lived in the hesitation, in the way people paused before dialing, in the way a call was discussed before it was made, as if it were a small journey that required preparation. Long-distance phone calls were not casual interruptions. They were decisions. You didn't reach for the phone because you were bored. You didn't call to fill silence. You called because something needed to be said, something that couldn't wait for a letter, but still deserved care. The phone itself was part of the ritual, heavy, solid, connected to the wall by a cord that stretched only so far, reminding you that communication had limits. You stood or sat where the phone allowed you to be. You didn't wander. You stayed put. Dialing took time. Each number pressed carefully, deliberately. A mistake meant starting over. That alone made you focus. It made you think about who you were calling and why. And then there was the waiting. Rings traveled across distance slowly, or at least they felt slow. You listened to them, counting without realizing it. Each ring carried a question. Would they be there? Would they answer? Was this a good time? When the voice finally came through, it never sounded close. Even when it was familiar, even when it belonged to someone you loved, there was a thinness to it, a softness, a reminder that miles existed between you. That distance shaped the conversation. People spoke more clearly. They didn't talk over one another as much. They left space at the end of sentences, knowing sound needed time to arrive. Silence wasn't awkward. It was expected. You listened harder. There was no speakerphone, no background noise from a dozen places at once. Other people in the house often knew a long-distance call was happening and adjusted themselves around it. Voices lowered, movement slowed. Privacy was borrowed, not assumed, because those calls cost money, sometimes a lot of it. You could hear the clock ticking even if you couldn't see it. Minutes mattered. Words mattered. That pressure didn't rush the conversation. It sharpened it. You didn't waste time on things that didn't need to be said. You went straight to what mattered, but you did it gently, carefully, as if each sentence had to justify its place. When the call ended, it ended completely. There was no follow-up text, no quick message to clarify something you forgot to say. If you missed a chance to speak, you carried that silence until the next letter or the next call. Missed calls stayed missed. If someone wasn't home, you didn't leave a message. You learned later that you had tried, or they learned you had tried. That attempt mattered on its own. Sometimes days passed before you connected, sometimes longer. And in that waiting, anticipation grew. Thoughts formed. Feelings settled. By the time voices finally met, they were ready. Looking back, those calls feel heavy in memory because they were heavy in life. They asked something of you: attention, intention, presence. Today, distance barely exists in conversation. Voices appear instantly. Words pile up without pause. Silence is filled immediately, often without thought. In the 1960s, distance shaped how people spoke to one another. It slowed the conversation down, and in doing so, it made every call feel like it mattered. Television that signed off at night. In the 1960s, television knew when to leave. That may sound strange now, but back then the screen had boundaries. It didn't follow you from room to room. It didn't glow endlessly in the background. It arrived at a certain hour, stayed for a while, and then quietly stepped away. Television wasn't always on. It was invited. People planned around it. Chairs were turned. Conversations paused. The room adjusted itself just slightly, acknowledging that something was about to happen. Watching television felt like a shared activity, not a private escape. Programs had schedules that mattered. If you missed a show, there was no second chance waiting quietly somewhere else. You didn't rewind. You didn't replay. You either saw it or you heard about it later from someone who did. That made watching feel important. News came at specific times. Families gathered for it. Not everyone watched for the same reasons, but everyone watched together. The television didn't pull attention away from the room. It focused it briefly before giving it back. And then, at the end of the night, something remarkable happened. The broadcast ended, not gradually, not with suggestions of what to watch next. It simply stopped. Sometimes there was a final message, sometimes a tone, sometimes an image that faded slowly into nothing. And then the screen went dark. That darkness changed the room. The soft hum disappeared, the light vanished, reflections in the glass dissolved. What remained was the space itself, the furniture, the quiet, the people who had been sitting there the whole time. Television didn't linger. It didn't demand to be filled with something else. It didn't wait impatiently for the next program. It accepted that the day was over. That ending mattered more than we realized. It told everyone, without words, that it was time to move on, to talk, to prepare for sleep, to sit in silence without feeling like something was missing. The room felt different when the television was off, larger somehow, more real. You noticed sounds again, footsteps, breathing, the house settling. You noticed each other. Children learned that nighttime had a shape, that there was a clear line between day and rest. Adults felt the permission to stop paying attention. Television didn't compete with the rest of life. It fit into it. There was no sense that you needed to keep watching, no fear of missing out. Nothing was continuing without you somewhere else. When the screen went dark, the world paused with it. Today, screens never truly turn off. They dim, maybe. They shift. They offer something else. Silence is treated like a mistake that needs correcting. But in the 1960s, the end of the broadcast was not a failure. It was a signal, a quiet understanding that the day had reached its natural conclusion. And when the television signed off, it left something behind that we rarely notice now. A room at rest. Cars that smelled like materials. Cars in the 1960s didn't just move you. They surrounded you. You noticed it the moment you opened the door. A mix of vinyl, rubber, metal, gasoline, and something faintly electrical. It wasn't a pleasant smell in the modern sense, but it was unmistakable. You could recognize it with your eyes closed. Every car had it. Seats were covered in vinyl that warmed quickly in the sun and stuck slightly to bare skin in summer. In winter, that same vinyl felt cold and firm, holding on to the night air until the heater finally caught up. You shifted in your seat, aware of the surface beneath you. Nothing was hidden. Dashboards were hard. Controls were mechanical. You felt resistance when you turned a knob or pushed a button. Every action had feedback. The car responded physically, not digitally. Engines made themselves known. They rumbled differently when cold. They sounded strained when something wasn't right. People listened. You learned the language of your car without realizing it. A strange knock, a delayed start, a rough idle. Those sounds mattered. Windows rolled down by hand. You turned a handle and felt the gears engage. Air rushed in unevenly, carrying dust, exhaust, and whatever the road happened to offer that day. Smells changed as you drove. Fields, towns, gas stations, rain. Driving connected you to the outside world instead of sealing you off from it. Back seats were wide, sometimes facing sideways. You slid across them during turns, your body learning balance the hard way. Seat belts weren't always present, and when they weren't always used. Trust filled that space instead. Adults drove differently then. Slower, more deliberately. Roads felt wider even when they weren't. Trips took longer, not just in time, but in experience. You noticed landmarks because you had to. You remembered them because there was nothing else to distract you. Gas stations were part of the journey. You pulled in. Someone came out to meet you. Windshields were wiped. Oil was checked. Conversations happened. Brief, ordinary, human. The smell of gasoline lingered on your hands afterward. Cars weren't quiet. They didn't pretend to be effortless. They asked for attention, for care, for understanding. When something went wrong, you didn't ignore it. You felt it immediately. That awareness shaped how people drove and how they rode. Children learned patience in cars. There were no screens, no headphones. You stared out the window, counted things, let your thoughts wander. Time stretched. Looking back, I realize how much those smells and sounds anchored memories. Certain moments return not as images, but as sensations. Heat on vinyl, the low hum of an engine, the sharp scent of fuel when a door opened too soon after stopping. Today, cars are sealed, controlled, filtered, designed to erase sensation. You arrive without remembering the journey. In the 1960s, the journey stayed with you because the car never let you forget you were moving through the world. Neighborhoods you knew by sound. In the 1960s, neighborhoods didn't need signs to tell you where you were. You knew by listening. Every street had its own rhythm, its own collection of sounds that repeated day after day until they became invisible. Screen doors slamming, a distant radio playing through an open window, footsteps on concrete, a dog barking somewhere down the block, always at the same hour. You didn't need to look out the window to know what was happening outside. You could hear it. Mornings sounded different from afternoons. Afternoons sounded different from evenings. The neighborhood spoke in patterns, and everyone learned them without being taught. When a sound didn't belong, it stood out immediately. You knew which houses were loud and which ones stayed quiet. You knew where voices carried and where they disappeared. You knew which doors closed gently and which ones never did. That knowledge created borders you couldn't see. Children learned those borders early. There were places you could go without asking and places you couldn't cross without a reason, not because someone told you, but because the sounds changed when you got too far. The street felt unfamiliar, wrong somehow. At night, neighborhoods grew smaller. Streetlights hummed to life one by one. Cars passed less often. Conversations softened. Radios were turned down. You could hear a single set of footsteps from half a block away. That quiet wasn't empty. It was full of information. You knew who was still awake, who had company, who had gone to bed early. You knew when someone came home late just by the sound of a car door closing carefully, trying not to wake the house. Windows were open more often. Sounds traveled freely. Privacy wasn't sealed behind glass and insulation. It was negotiated naturally. People lowered their voices because they knew others could hear. Children played outside until the light changed, not until a clock said so. The neighborhood itself decided when the day was over. Shadows stretched longer. The air cooled. Sound slowed. That was the signal. When kids finally came home, they carried the neighborhood with them. Dust on shoes, voices still echoing in their ears. The sense of having been part of something larger than a room. There were no alerts to tell you what was happening nearby. No feeds to scroll. If something happened on your street, you knew because you heard it, or because someone told you the next day. That made awareness local. It made attention personal. You didn't feel connected to everything. You felt connected to where you were. Today, neighborhoods are quieter in a different way, sealed, insulated, sounds trapped behind walls and headphones. You can live next to someone for years without knowing the rhythm of their life. In the 1960s, you knew your neighborhood by heart, not by its name, but by the way it sounded when the day was ending. Children disappearing. All day. In the 1960s, children didn't need schedules. They needed daylight. Mornings began with doors opening and closing, not carefully, not quietly, just the sound of kids leaving, shoes half-tied, jackets forgotten, breakfast still warm in their stomachs. No one stood at the door counting heads. No one asked where they were going. They were just going. Once outside, the day belonged to them. Hours passed without check-ins, without updates, without anyone wondering where they were every few minutes. Children moved through neighborhoods freely, guided by instinct, curiosity, and an unspoken understanding of boundaries. They felt more than they saw. They knew how far they could go, not because someone told them, but because the world changed when they went too far. Streets felt different. Sound shifted. The air itself seemed unfamiliar. That was usually enough to turn back. Time worked differently then. There were no clocks on wrists, no alarms counting down. Hunger, boredom, and light were the only markers. Lunch might be remembered or forgotten entirely. Either way, no one panicked. Adults trusted the space between moments. Kids learned how to fill it. They invented games that lasted all afternoon. Rules changed mid-play. Arguments were resolved without witnesses. Injuries were judged quickly, serious or not, and life continued accordingly. Scraped knees were normal. Dirty hands were expected. Torn shirts were explained with simple phrases that didn't require detail. I fell. We were running. It was nothing. And often it was. The absence of constant supervision did something important. It taught children how to pay attention, to listen for cars, to watch shadows, to notice when the air shifted or the sky darkened faster than expected. They learned responsibility not through instruction, but through experience. When afternoon leaned toward evening, something subtle happened. The neighborhood quieted. Sound softened. Streetlights flickered on. One by one, doors opened again. Children returned. They came back slowly, reluctantly, sometimes in groups that dissolved as each kid reached their own house. Faces were flushed. Clothes were marked with the day's evidence. Stories spilled out unevenly, some exaggerated, some forgotten before they were ever told. No one asked for a full account. The day didn't need documentation. It had been lived. There were no photos of those hours, no recordings, no proof that any of it happened. And yet, it remains vivid in memory precisely because it belonged only to the people who were there. Today, childhood is carefully tracked, measured, checked in on constantly. Freedom exists, but it is supervised, scheduled, and documented. In the 1960s, children disappeared all day and came back knowing exactly where they belonged. Milk in glass bottles. In the 1960s, milk arrived quietly, not in cartons, not sealed in plastic, not hidden on a shelf behind a dozen choices. It came in glass bottles. You didn't go looking for it. It appeared. Early in the morning, before most people were awake. A soft clink on the porch, a dull thud near the door. Sounds so ordinary they barely registered, yet specific enough that you always knew what they meant. Milk had weight then. You felt it in your hand. The glass was thick, slightly cold, sometimes damp from the air. You could see the milk before you drank it. You could see the cream line near the top, floating just beneath the cap, reminding you that this was something real, something that hadn't been designed to look uniform. The caps were simple, cardboard, colored. You learned their meaning without instruction, one color for one kind, another for something different. No labels shouting benefits, no explanations. Just quiet understanding passed from one morning to the next. Opening a bottle was a small ritual. You pressed your thumb under the cap and lifted. Sometimes it resisted. Sometimes it came off cleanly. Occasionally, a drop spilled, and you wiped it away without thinking. Small imperfections were expected. Milk didn't last forever. That fact shaped behavior. You drank it because it was there. You didn't stockpile. You didn't forget about it in the back of a refrigerator. When it was gone, it was gone. And you waited for the next delivery. The bottles didn't disappear when they were empty. They stayed. You rinsed them, set them back where they had been found. They would be taken away and used again. Nothing about that felt unusual. It was simply how things worked. Objects moved in circles instead of lines. Children were often the ones sent to fetch the milk. It was one of those tasks that felt important without being complicated. Don't drop it. Don't spill it. Bring it inside. You learned care through repetition. On cold mornings, the bottles were colder than the air. Sometimes a thin layer of frost clung to the glass. In summer, they sweated in the heat, leaving rings on wooden steps. Those details stuck. They became part of the memory of the house itself. Milk tasted different then, not because it was better in some romantic way, but because it was closer to its source. It hadn't traveled as far. It hadn't been stripped of its variation. Some days it tasted richer, some days lighter. You accepted that. Milk wasn't something you customized. It wasn't a statement. It was a presence. When deliveries stopped, you noticed immediately. The porch sounded wrong. The morning felt incomplete. Something small but dependable was missing. Today, milk is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Shelves are full. Choices are endless. Containers are designed to be forgotten once emptied. But in the 1960s, milk arrived in glass bottles. And every morning, without thinking about it, you were reminded that some things were meant to return. Metal ice trays. In the 1960s, ice did not appear by itself. It had to be made. That simple fact shaped how people treated it. Ice wasn't endless. It wasn't invisible. It was something you prepared in advance, knowing you would need it later. And that meant thinking ahead, even in small ways. The trays were metal, cold to the touch, heavier than they looked. You filled them carefully at the sink, water sloshing close to the edge if you weren't paying attention. Spilling a little was common. Spilling a lot meant starting over. Once filled, the trays were placed into freezers that hummed steadily, quietly doing their work. There were no displays, no sounds to tell you when the ice was ready. You learned patience by waiting. Later, when the time came, you reached inside and pulled the tray out. It resisted slightly, frozen to the surface beneath it. You held it in both hands, feeling the cold bite into your fingers. Then came the handle. You lifted it slowly, felt the pressure build. The metal tray flexed just enough. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, release. The ice cracked free all at once, loud and sharp, scattering cubes unevenly into whatever you had waiting below. It was never silent. That sound became part of kitchens everywhere. A short, decisive crack that meant something had been completed. Ice had been earned. The cubes weren't perfect. Some were smaller. Some fused together. Edges were rough. You didn't expect uniformity. You accepted what you got. Ice trays taught restraint. You didn't grab handfuls without thinking. You didn't fill glasses carelessly. You knew there was a limited supply, and once it was gone until the trays were refilled and frozen again. Children were often warned not to waste ice. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Ice represented effort, time, planning. In summer, that effort felt especially meaningful. A cold drink after hours of heat carried weight. The ice clicked against the glass, melting slowly, doing its job without hurry. There was no button to press, no door to open for instant results. The freezer didn't serve you. It cooperated with you. Today, ice appears endlessly. Dispensers hum. Cubes fall without thought. The act itself barely registers. But in the 1960s, ice required attention. And because of that, every cold drink felt deliberate. Summer without air conditioning. Everywhere. In the 1960s, summer announced itself. You didn't escape it the moment you stepped indoors. You carried it with you. Heat followed you through open doors and stayed, settling into rooms like a presence everyone acknowledged, but no one argued with. Air conditioning existed, but it wasn't everywhere. And because it wasn't everywhere, it didn't define how people lived. Instead, people adjusted. Windows were opened with intention, not all of them, just the ones that caught the breeze if you were lucky enough to have one. Curtains were drawn halfway, not to block the heat entirely, but to soften it. Light filtered in gently, turning rooms amber in the afternoon. Box fans became part of the furniture. They hummed steadily, pushing warm air around rather than replacing it. You positioned them carefully, testing angles, learning through trial where the air moved best. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, they stayed on. Summer sounds changed when windows were open. You heard more of the outside world, cars passing, neighbors talking, lawn sprinklers clicking on and off, cicadas in the distance, relentless and rhythmic. Heat had a soundtrack, and everyone knew it. Clothes changed with the season. Lighter fabrics, rolled sleeves, shoes left by the door. You dressed for the weather because there was no escaping it. Skin met air more often. You noticed temperature shifts in a way that's rare now. Days slowed, not because anyone planned it that way, but because heat demanded it. You moved carefully. You paused without apology. No one expected speed in July. Effort was measured, energy conserved. Meals adjusted too. Lighter food. Cold drinks earned slowly. Ice saved for when it mattered. Kitchens grew warmer by the hour, and cooking was done early when possible, before the day reached its peak. Nights brought relief, but not instantly. You waited for the air to cool. You listened for it. Eventually, something shifted. The fan felt less like a necessity and more like a comfort. Sheets stuck less. Sleep came unevenly at first, then deeply. Porches mattered in summer. They became gathering places again. Chairs were pulled outside. Conversation stretched out, unhurried. You didn't rush back into cooled rooms. There were fewer of them anyway. You stayed where the air moved and where other people were. Sweat wasn't treated like a failure, it was expected. It was proof you had been part of the day. You wiped it away and kept going. Children learned the limits of heat early. Running slowed naturally. Games adjusted. Shade became valuable. Water hoses turned into relief. Laughter mixing with spray in backyards until someone decided it was enough. That decision usually came from instinct, not instruction. Today, summer is something many people move through without feeling. Temperatures are controlled, rooms are sealed, the season exists mostly outside glass. In the 1960s, summer lived inside houses. And because of that, everyone learned how to live with it together. Letters written because they had to be. In the 1960s, letters weren't romantic by default. They were practical. You didn't write because it felt special. You wrote because it was the only way to reach someone who wasn't nearby. Distance demanded ink. Paper carried responsibility. You sat down to write with intention, not casually, not between other things. You cleared a space. You found a pen that worked. You chose paper that felt right in your hands. The act itself slowed you before the first word was written. Writing made you think ahead. Once the words left your hand, they were committed. There was no deleting, no rephrasing after the fact. Mistakes stayed visible, crossed out, circled, or simply accepted. That awareness shaped how sentences formed. You thought before you wrote because thinking afterward wouldn't help. Handwriting mattered. People recognized it instantly. Loops, pressure, slant. Every letter carried the shape of the person who wrote it. You could tell someone's mood just by the way the lines leaned or the ink pressed into the page. Letters took time to arrive. Days passed. Sometimes weeks. And during that waiting, the words you had written lived on their own, traveling without you. You imagined them being opened, read slowly, read twice, maybe set down and returned to later. That delay changed the meaning of communication. You didn't write impulsively, you wrote thoughtfully. You chose what was worth saying because space was limited and time was long. Small details mattered. Ordinary moments were included because they were the substance of life, not filler. Receiving a letter was an event. You recognized the envelope before opening it. The handwriting on the front confirmed who it was from. The weight told you whether there was more than just paper inside. You didn't tear it open quickly. You took your time. Often, letters were read in quiet, alone, or with someone nearby who understood not to interrupt. You absorbed the words fully because you knew you wouldn't get another message right away. This was it, for now. Afterward, letters were kept, folded, placed in drawers, tucked into books, not as keepsakes at first, but as references, proof of connection, something solid that existed even when the person was far away. Children learned letter writing early, not as an art, but as a necessity. Thank you notes, messages to relatives, careful spelling, neat lines. You learned that communication deserved effort. And when letters stopped arriving, you noticed. The silence meant something. It wasn't filled automatically. It wasn't explained away. You waited, sometimes longer than you wanted to, trusting that words were on their way. Today, messages are constant, immediate, correctable. They arrive faster than thought and disappear just as quickly. In the 1960s, letters asked for patience, and in return, they taught people how to say what they actually meant. Stores that actually closed in the 1960s, stores knew when to stop. Not just slow down, not just reduce hours. They closed. Doors were locked. Lights went out. Signs were flipped. And no one expected otherwise. Shopping had boundaries, and those boundaries shaped how people moved through their days. You planned around store hours because you had to. If you forgot something, you waited. Not everything was available all the time, and that limitation felt normal. It didn't feel like inconvenience. It felt like structure. Sundays were the clearest example. Most stores were closed completely. Streets felt different, quieter. Parking lots sat empty. Windows reflected sky instead of movement. Commerce stepped aside and let the day breathe. That quiet wasn't accidental. It gave the week a rhythm, a rise and a fall. Work days carried urgency because rest was coming. Rest mattered because it was protected. Inside homes, Sundays felt wider, meals lasted longer. Conversations stretched. Time wasn't something to manage, it was something to inhabit. There was no rush to run errands, no pressure to be productive. People adjusted without complaint. If you needed groceries, you went another day. If something broke, it waited. You learned to anticipate needs, to think ahead. Planning wasn't optimization, it was awareness. Even on regular days, stores didn't stay open endlessly. Evening hours ended, clerks went home. The idea that someone should always be available to sell you something hadn't taken root yet. That absence created space. When stores closed, people returned to each other. Streets emptied naturally. Homes filled again. The day transitioned instead of snapping from one task to the next. Children learned this rhythm early. Errands happened at certain times. Waiting was expected. Patience wasn't praised. It was assumed. And because shopping didn't dominate every moment, it held less power. Buying things was part of life, not the center of it. Needs were met, then attention moved elsewhere. Today, availability is constant. Something is always open, always delivering, always ready. Time has lost its edges. In the 1960s, closed doors weren't a failure. They were a signal that the day had done enough. Gas you didn't waste. In the 1960s, gasoline was cheap, but it wasn't careless. That distinction mattered. People didn't treat fuel as something endless just because it was affordable. It still represented effort, machinery, distance. You understood that something had to happen for that car to move, and you respected it. Gas stations were not places you rushed through. You pulled in slowly. A bell rang when your tires crossed the line. Someone came out to meet you. Not a screen, not a voice from a speaker, but a person. They asked how much you wanted. They listened. While the tank filled, other things happened. The windshield was wiped. Oil was checked. Sometimes the hood was lifted just long enough for a quick look. Not because something was wrong, but because attention was part of the process. Engines were listened to, not ignored. People recognized the sounds their cars made, a hesitation, a knock, a change in rhythm. You didn't wait for a warning light. There often wasn't one. You noticed with your ears, your hands, your feet on the pedals. Gas wasn't burned without thought. Trips were combined. Routes were chosen deliberately. You didn't drive somewhere without a reason. Not because you were trying to save money, but because movement itself felt intentional. Driving was an act, not background noise. When gas prices changed, people noticed immediately. Conversations happened. Adjustments were made, but there was no sense that the system was fragile or disposable. You adapted. because adaptation was expected. Children learned early that fuel mattered. You didn't leave the car running unnecessarily. You didn't press the pedal hard without reason. These weren't rules explained in detail. They were habits absorbed by watching. Gasoline had a smell you recognized instantly. It clung briefly to your clothes after a fill-up. It marked the moment. It reminded you that the car wasn't magic. It was mechanical, dependent, real. Road trips felt different because of that awareness. You noticed distances. You remembered gas stops. Certain stations became landmarks, not because they were special, but because they were part of the journey. Running out of gas wasn't dramatic. It was embarrassing. It meant you hadn't paid attention. It meant you missed a sign you should have noticed. Responsibility lived in small things like that. Today, fuel is still there, but the relationship has changed. Cars isolate you from the process. Systems manage themselves. Awareness fades. In the 1960s, gasoline wasn't something you forgot about. You felt it every time the engine turned over, and because of that, every mile meant something. Shoes that were repaired. In the 1960s, shoes were not disposable. They were companions. You didn't replace them the moment they wore down. You noticed the wear, the thinning sole, the crease that deepened over time, the heel that leaned just slightly to one side, shaped by the way you walked through the world. That wear meant something. Shoes carried evidence of where you'd been. They remembered pavement, dirt, stairs, long days. When they began to fail, it wasn't a signal to throw them away. It was a signal to take them somewhere. Cobblers existed everywhere, small shops tucked into corners of towns, windows filled with half-finished shoes, leather scraps, tools worn smooth by use. You didn't need an appointment. You walked in, set the shoes on the counter, and explained the problem in a few words. The cobbler picked them up, turned them over, bent the sole, pressed a thumb into the leather. He didn't rush. He listened to the shoes as much as to you. Then he nodded. Come back in a few days. Repair took time. You walked differently while you waited. Maybe in an older pair. Maybe in something borrowed. The absence of your usual shoes made you aware of how much you relied on them. When you returned, they felt familiar and new. The sole was firm again, the heel balanced. Sometimes the leather was darker where it had been treated. You noticed the change immediately. It wasn't hidden. It was honest. Shoes came back stronger, not invisible. Children learned this early. You didn't complain when shoes wore out. You brought them in. You understood that things lasted longer when someone cared for them. That understanding extended beyond footwear. Repair was normal. Furniture was fixed. Radios were opened. Cars were tuned. Objects were expected to age, not vanish. Scratches and scuffs weren't flaws, they were chapters. Shoes taught patience. You didn't expect everything to be instant. You accepted waiting as part of ownership. That waiting made the return feel earned. There was also restraint. You walked more carefully when shoes mattered. You avoided puddles when you could. You noticed how you moved. Care became a habit, not a rule. Today, shoes arrive perfect and leave quickly. They're replaced before they're known. Worn once, then forgotten. Repair exists, but it's rare, almost nostalgic in itself. In the 1960s, repair wasn't nostalgic. It was practical. Shoes stayed with you longer because you believed they should. And because of that, every step carried a little more weight. Radio voices that felt like neighbors. In the 1960s, radio wasn't background noise. It was company. Radio stayed in kitchens, living rooms, garages. They didn't move with you. You moved around them. You turned them on deliberately, and when they were on, they belonged to the room. The voices were familiar, not famous in the modern sense. Familiar in the way neighbors are familiar. You recognize them instantly. The tone, the cadence, the way they said certain words every single day. They didn't need to introduce themselves. You already knew who was speaking. Those voices mattered because they stayed. They were there in the mornings, easing people into the day. They followed you through chores. They kept you company while you worked with your hands. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They spoke at a human pace. Weather reports were listened to closely, not out of curiosity but necessity. You were outside more. Weather shaped plans directly. A storm meant something real, not just an inconvenience. When a radio voice talked about rain or heat, you believed them, not because they were always right, but because they were careful. Music arrived differently too. Songs weren't chosen on demand. They were given to you. You listened to whatever came next, and because of that, music felt broader. You heard things you didn't expect. You learned tastes you didn't choose. And when a song you loved came on, it felt like a gift. You didn't rewind it. You didn't save it. You listened all the way through, knowing it might be a long time before you heard it again. That made listening active. Radio voices didn't compete for attention. They didn't interrupt. They filled space gently, leaving room for thought. When the radio was turned off, the silence felt natural, not empty. You trusted those voices. They didn't try to be everything. They stayed local, grounded, human. Today, voices come from everywhere and nowhere. They overlap. They chase attention. They disappear as quickly as they arrive. In the 1960s, radio voices stayed long enough to become part of daily life. They didn't just tell you what was happening. They kept you company while it happened. Calendars that stayed on the wall all year. In the 1960s, a calendar was not temporary. It stayed. One calendar, 12 months, hung on the wall where everyone could see it. Kitchens, hallways, near phones. You didn't replace it when the month ended. You turned the page. That small action mattered. Each page came down deliberately, sometimes on the first day of the month, sometimes a few days late. No one rushed. Time didn't demand precision. It allowed approximation. Dates were written by hand. Birthdays, appointments, notes in the margins, a reminder to do something that mattered enough to write down. The calendar slowly filled with ink, marks accumulating as the year went on. You could see time passing. Pages above grew thinner. Pages below grew thicker. By the end of the year, the calendar carried weight. It had lived with you. It showed evidence of a year spent doing things. Children learn time this way, not by alerts or reminders, but by watching pages change. They learned which months felt long, which passed quickly, which carried holidays, which felt empty. Time wasn't hidden. You didn't carry it in your pocket. You didn't check it constantly. You visited it. You looked up, stood still for a moment, and saw where you were. Missed dates stayed missed. If you forgot something, you noticed later. You didn't get an alert beforehand. That didn't cause panic. It caused reflection. You adjusted. You remembered next time. Calendars didn't optimize your life. They recorded it. At the end of the year, the old calendar wasn't always thrown away immediately. Sometimes it stayed up for a while, quietly reminding everyone that something had ended. The new one didn't erase the old one, it replaced it. Today, time refreshes constantly. It resets. It disappears the moment it passes. There's little evidence left behind. In the 1960s, calendars stayed on the wall all year, and because of that, time felt visible, not managed, but lived, borrowed time. In the 1960s, time was not something you owned. You borrowed it. You didn't carry it with you everywhere. You didn't check it constantly. You didn't feel responsible for tracking every minute. Time lived outside of you, in the world itself. You looked up to find it. Clocks were mounted on buildings, above storefronts, inside schools, at train stations. They were public, shared. You trusted them without question. If a clock said it was late, it was late. There was no second opinion waiting in your pocket. Watches existed, but they weren't universal. And even when people wore them, they needed attention. You wound them. You noticed when they slowed. You accepted that they weren't always perfectly accurate. That imperfection shaped behavior. If someone said they'd arrive around a certain time, that was enough. Around carried meaning. It allowed room for traffic, for conversation, for the day to move as it would. Being a few minutes late didn't feel like failure. It felt human. Appointments were softer. You remembered them instead of being reminded. You missed some. You arrived early to others. Both were acceptable. Life wasn't measured down to the second. Public clocks created shared moments. People checked the time together. A glance upward before crossing a street. A pause outside a store window. Time became something observed collectively, not managed privately. Children learned time by feel, by the length of shadows, by hunger, by the sound of evening. They didn't count minutes. They sensed when the day was changing. That instinct stayed with them. Waiting felt different when you weren't tracking it. You waited without watching the clock. You occupied yourself. You noticed your surroundings. You didn't measure delay. You experienced it. Today, time belongs to us in theory, but it owns us in practice. We track it constantly. We measure productivity in minutes. We feel pressure from every passing second. In the 1960s, time lived outside the body. You borrowed it when you needed it. And when you didn't, you let it pass without watching. Payphones, you always knew the location of. In the 1960s, everyone knew where the nearest payphone was. You didn't think about it often, but you knew. They stood on street corners, inside stores, near diners, at gas stations. They were part of the landscape, like mailboxes or streetlights. You passed them daily without noticing until the moment you needed one, and then you knew exactly where to go. Payphones didn't ask for much, just a coin, sometimes two. You carried change for that reason, not as a habit you questioned, but as quiet preparedness. Coins had purpose. You held the receiver and listened for the tone. If you didn't hear it, you tried again. The metal was cool against your ear, the cord heavy, stretching only so far. You stood still while you talked, rooted to that small square of sidewalk or floor. Calls were brief, not rushed, focused. You said what needed to be said. You didn't wander. You didn't multitask. The world continued around you while you stayed present inside the call. Privacy was negotiated. People nearby pretended not to listen. You lowered your voice. Sometimes you turned your body slightly away, as if that helped. Sometimes you waited until no one else was close. If someone didn't answer, that was it. You hung up. You tried later. There was no message left behind, no record of your attempt. The effort itself was enough. Payphones taught restraint. You didn't call without reason. You didn't fill silence. Communication required intention, movement, preparation. You had to go somewhere to reach someone. Children learned their locations early, not because they were told, but because they mattered. If something went wrong, if plans changed, if you needed help. The payphone was there, reliable, silent, waiting. Today, communication is constant and invisible. You reach people instantly from anywhere. Distance barely exists. In the 1960s, connection had a place. You walked to it, and because of that, every call meant you had already decided it mattered. Vacations with few photos. In the 1960s, vacations didn't try to prove they happened. They simply did. You packed lightly, clothes folded, not curated. A suitcase closed with the quiet confidence that you probably forgot something and that it would be fine. There was no checklist for memories, no pressure to capture every moment. Photos were rare. A camera might come along, but it didn't dominate the trip. Film was limited. Each frame mattered. You didn't take pictures just because something existed. You waited for moments that felt worth keeping. That waiting changed how you looked at things. You paid attention. You noticed when the light shifted, when people laughed without trying, when the day felt complete. Those were the moments that earned a photograph, not because they were impressive, but because they felt right. Most of the vacation lived unrecorded. Car rides stretched long, windows stayed open, conversations wandered, silence filled the spaces between towns. You watched the road change without needing to explain it to anyone later. Stops became memories without evidence. A diner by the road, a beach at the wrong time of day, a place you never returned to but remembered clearly. The absence of photos didn't weaken those memories, it strengthened them. You told stories instead. When you came home, people asked how it was, and you answered in sentences, not images. Details emerged as you spoke. What surprised you? What went wrong? What stayed with you? Stories evolved. Each time they were told, something new surfaced. Something unnecessary fell away. Memory shaped itself naturally, without needing to match a record. Children learned that trips mattered even when nothing was saved. They remembered smells, sounds, the way beds felt unfamiliar, the quiet of returning home. Those sensations didn't need validation. Today, vacations often feel unfinished unless they're documented. Moments are filtered before they're felt. The future audience is always present. In the 1960s, vacations ended quietly, and they stayed alive because they lived only in the people who were there. Quiet trash. In the 1960s, trash didn't make noise. It didn't announce itself. It didn't multiply endlessly. It didn't demand attention. Waste existed, but it stayed in the background where it belonged. Packaging was simple. Paper, cardboard, glass, metal, things that had weight and purpose before they were discarded. You noticed what you threw away because there wasn't much of it. Garbage cans weren't always full. They waited patiently. Bags weren't overstuffed. Lids closed easily. There was no constant reminder of consumption. Trash left the house quietly and returned just as quietly in the form of something else. Bottles went back. Containers were reused. Paper served more than one purpose. Children learned this without lessons. You didn't throw things away casually. You hesitated, not because you were frugal, but because disposal felt final. You thought twice before deciding something was no longer useful. Trash day had a rhythm. Cans appeared at the curb, then disappeared. The street returned to normal. There was no overflow, no scattered debris. The process didn't interrupt the day. Because waste was quieter, it was also more honest. You could see how much you used. You could feel the limits. Consumption wasn't invisible, But it wasn't celebrated either. Food scraps went where they belonged. Paper burned or recycled before the word became common. Broken things were fixed when possible. Replacement was not the first instinct. Today, waste is constant and loud. Packaging piles up. Disposal feels endless. Trash leaves without consequence, disappearing into systems we rarely think about. In the 1960s, trash reminded you of what you had used. And because of that, you used things more carefully, not out of fear, but out of quiet awareness. Dinner as the center of the day. In the 1960s, dinner was not flexible. It didn't drift. It didn't wait. It didn't happen whenever. It happened at a time. That time shaped the rest of the day. Errands were planned around it. Play ended because of it. Conversations paused, knowing they would resume at the table. Dinner wasn't squeezed in. Everything else moved aside. The house changed as it approached. Sounds softened. Movement slowed. The air filled with familiar smells that didn't need explanation. Everyone knew what they meant. Dinner was coming. People arrived home because of it. Not eventually, not when they felt like it. They returned because that was where the day gathered itself. The table wasn't just furniture. It was an anchor. There were no screens competing for attention. Chairs faced each other. Plates were passed hand to hand. Glasses were refilled without asking. Silence wasn't awkward. It was allowed. Talking wasn't mandatory. Being present was enough. Meals took time, not because anyone rushed, but because no one needed to. You ate at the speed of conversation. Forks rested while stories were told. Food cooled and reheated in the rhythm of the room. Children learned structure here. They learned when the day ended, when play paused, when listening mattered. Dinner taught them that time could belong to people instead of tasks. Arguments happened at tables too, but they were contained. They ended when the meal ended. The table held them long enough for them to settle. After dinner, the day felt complete. Dishes were cleared, chairs pushed in. The house exhaled. Evening began properly, not as a continuation of chaos, but as a new chapter. Today, meals float. They happen between things, in front of screens, standing, alone, together, but elsewhere. Food fills hunger, but rarely time. In the 1960s, dinner held the day in place, and because of that, everything else knew where it belonged. Typewriters that made thinking audible. In the 1960s, thinking made noise. You could hear it. Typewriters sat on desks and tables, heavy and unapologetic. They didn't disappear when not in use. They occupied space, waiting patiently for someone to sit down and commit to words. Each key press mattered. You felt resistance under your fingers. You heard the strike as metal met paper. The sound was sharp, decisive. It confirmed that a thought had been turned into something real. Mistakes were visible. There was no hiding them, no deleting. You crossed words out or started over. That reality changed how people wrote. You paused longer. You chose words carefully. You thought before committing. Writing was slower, not inefficient, intentional. The pace forced clarity. You couldn't rush a sentence without hearing it fall apart. You listened to your own thoughts as they took shape. Rooms sounded different when someone was writing. The steady rhythm of keys, the occasional pause, the carriage returned sliding back with a firm sweep. It was a sound of concentration, recognized and respected. People didn't interrupt it lightly. Finished pages felt earned. You lifted them out and felt their weight. You stacked them carefully. You read them over, pencil in hand, making changes deliberately. Writing wasn't a draft. It was a process. Children learned early that words carried effort. School papers weren't typed casually. Letters took time. You understood that communication required work. That saying something clearly was worth slowing down for. Typewriters didn't allow multitasking. You sat, you focused, you finished, or you stopped. There was no background writing, no half attention. Today, writing is silent and endless. Words appear and disappear without consequence. Thought moves faster than reflection. In the 1960s, thinking announced itself. And because you could hear it, you respected it. Streetlights, you noticed. In the 1960s, streetlights were not decoration. They were signals. You noticed the moment they came on, not because they were bright, but because night still belonged to darkness then. Light was rare enough to matter. When a streetlight flickered to life, it meant something had changed. Day was letting go. The glow wasn't harsh. It spread gently, pooling on sidewalks and corners. It didn't erase shadows. It softened them. You could still see the night beyond the light, waiting patiently at the edges. Streetlights hummed, a low, steady sound you only heard when you slowed down enough to notice it. That hum became part of evening. It blended with crickets, distant traffic, voices carrying a little farther in the cooler air. Children learned time from those lights. No one checked a clock. No one needed to. When the street lights came on, play ended naturally. Not immediately, but soon. It was a shared understanding, passed down without words. Adults felt it too. Porches filled. Conversations shifted. The day no longer asked for effort. The light gave permission to slow down, to stop expecting anything new to happen. Streets looked different under those lights. Familiar places felt altered, but safe. Sidewalks gleamed slightly. Wet pavement reflected halos of yellow and white. The world felt smaller, contained, manageable. There was comfort in that. You could walk at night without feeling exposed. You knew where the light was and where it wasn't. You adjusted your steps accordingly. Awareness replaced fear. Streetlights didn't follow you. They stayed where they were. You moved from one pool of light to the next, feeling the night in between. That movement made you present. You noticed where you were. Today, light is everywhere. Cities glow endlessly. Darkness is treated like a problem to be solved. The night rarely gets a chance to exist on its own. In the 1960s, streetlights respected the dark. They didn't erase it. They marked time. Laundry that took the whole day. In the 1960s, laundry was not invisible. It announced itself. It began early and stayed with you, not as a background task, but as the work of the day. You planned around it because you had to. Once laundry started, it claimed the house. Machines were louder. They shook. They clanked. They demanded attention. You didn't press a button and walk away for hours. You listened for changes in sound. You checked progress by feel. Water mattered. You felt its temperature. You noticed how much was used. You waited for it to fill. You waited for it to drain. Time passed between steps, not because it was wasted, but because it was necessary. Clotheslines were common. Sheets snapped in the breeze. Shirts moved slowly in the sun. Fabric carried the smell of air and light when it came back inside. You knew exactly which clothes had dried outside and which hadn't. Weather shaped the process. A sudden cloud meant adjustment. Rain changed plans. Wind helped. Sun mattered. Laundry connected you to the day whether you wanted it to or not. Folding took time. You stood still and handled each piece. Warm fabric passed through your hands. You noticed wear, loose buttons, thinning cloth. Laundry was inspection as much as cleaning. Children learned responsibility here. They carried baskets. They matched socks. They learned patience by waiting for things to finish. Nothing about it was rushed. When laundry ended, it felt earned. The house smelled different, fresh, calm. Drawers filled again. Order returned slowly, not instantly. Today, laundry disappears into machines. It happens while other things happen. You forget it's there until it's done. In the 1960s, laundry demanded your presence, and because of that, it reminded you that even ordinary work had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Movies you could miss forever. In the 1960s, movies did not wait for you. They played when they played, and if you weren't there, they moved on without regret. That knowledge changed everything. Going to the movies required intention. You checked the time. You left early. You arrived before the lights dimmed because missing the beginning meant missing something that would never come back. There was no second screening later that night. No replay tomorrow. No quiet promise that you could catch it another way. The theater itself felt serious, dark, cool, slightly echoing. Seats creaked, the smell of popcorn mixed with dust and fabric. When the lights went down, they went down completely. The world outside ceased to exist. You watched closely, not casually, not halfway. You leaned forward without realizing it. Every scene mattered because it would not repeat itself. If you looked away, the story continued without you. People stayed until the end, not because they were polite, but because leaving early meant giving something up. Credits rolled slowly. Music played. No one rushed out immediately. The experience needed time to settle. Afterward, movies lived on as memory. You talked about them. You argued about them. You replayed scenes in your head, not on a screen. Details blurred and sharpened in unexpected ways. The story became personal. If you missed a film entirely, you accepted it. You heard about it secondhand. You imagined it through someone else's words. That absence became part of its mystery. Today, movies wait patiently. They pause. They rewind. They queue themselves up endlessly. Nothing is ever truly missed. In the 1960s, missing a movie meant it was gone. And because of that, everyone you saw felt like an event that belonged only to the moment it happened. Advertising that moved slowly. In the 1960s, advertising did not rush you. It introduced itself. Brands didn't shout from every surface. They appeared gradually, repeating the same message until it became familiar. You recognized slogans not because they were clever, but because you had lived with them. Ads waited their turn. They came between programs, between songs, on the back pages of magazines. They didn't interrupt conversations. They didn't chase attention across the day. That restraint built trust. You learned what a product was by seeing it again and again, unchanged. The same image, the same words. Consistency mattered more than novelty. Advertising spoke calmly. Voices were steady. Smiles were measured. Claims were modest. No one promised transformation. They promised reliability. Children absorbed ads without being targeted. They remembered jingles because they were catchy, not because they followed them everywhere. Advertising existed alongside life, not inside it. Buying decisions took time. You didn't click. You considered. You remembered an ad when the moment came, not the other way around. The product waited for you to need it. That slowness gave people space. You weren't constantly persuaded. You weren't reminded of what you lacked every minute. Desire grew slowly, or not at all. Today, advertising is relentless. It follows, it adapts, it interrupts, it competes for urgency and emotion. It demands reaction. In the 1960s, advertising assumed patience, and because of that, it felt less like pressure and more like a quiet suggestion, waiting to be remembered when the time was right. What we forgot without noticing. The strangest thing about the 1960s is not how different they were. It's how ordinary they felt at the time. No one woke up thinking they were living in something that would later be called an era. No one stopped to preserve the small things. No one thought to document the habits, the pauses, the quiet routines that filled the space between bigger moments. Life was simply happening. And because it was happening everywhere, all the time, no one thought it could disappear. Looking back now, it's clear that most of what we lost wasn't taken from us. It faded, gently, one convenience at a time, one improvement that made something easier, faster, quieter, until the old way quietly stepped aside and was never invited back. We gained a lot. That part is undeniable. We gained speed, access, comfort, certainty, the ability to reach anyone at any moment, the power to store everything, record everything, revisit everything whenever we want. But somewhere along the way, we lost the feeling that moments could end. In the 1960s, days had edges. Mornings began clearly. Evenings settled slowly. Nights belonged to darkness again. Time moved forward without asking to be replayed. You couldn't rewind conversations. You couldn't pause experiences. You couldn't capture everything. So you learned how to pay attention instead. Attention was the currency. You listened more closely because you might not hear something again. You watched carefully because the moment would pass whether you were ready or not. You remembered things not because they were recorded, but because they mattered enough to stay. Today, we live surrounded by proof. Proof that we were there. Proof that something happened. Proof that a moment existed. And yet, so many moments slip through us without leaving a mark. We experience them halfway, already thinking about how they'll be shared, stored, or revisited later. The future audience is always present, quietly pulling us away from the now. In the 1960s, the audience was smaller. Often, it was just you. That's why these forgotten things still carry weight. Not because they were better, but because they asked more of us. More patience, more awareness, more presence. They taught us how to wait, how to notice, how to live inside a moment without needing it to last forever. And maybe that's why remembering them feels so powerful now, because somewhere inside us we recognize what they gave us, even if we didn't know how to name it at the time. If any of these moments felt familiar to you, if you could feel them instead of just hearing about them, then you're carrying more of that past with you than you might realize. And if you find yourself returning to stories like this, listening again, letting them settle, that's not nostalgia pulling you backward. It's memory reminding you how to be present. So if you want to stay here a little longer, if you want more quiet stories from a time that didn't know it was disappearing, you're welcome to come back. And if something you heard today sparked a memory of your own, one you haven't thought about in years, you don't have to explain it. Just knowing it's still there is enough. Some things were never meant to be saved, only remembered.